Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on COVID-19 and the imperative of resurrecting the multilateral trading system. I will take you through the protocols for today's webinar before we begin. All participants and panelists are requested to remain on mute mode, and the host will be unmuting the panelists and participants during the course of the webinar as and when necessary. In case there is any technical obstacle from the host's end, I will request my co-host Mehta to unmute you. We will also be taking question and answers for the discussion round post the speakers session. And for that, we request you to put in your questions in the chat box and not through the audio. Your messages or questions should be directed to the CUTS Zoom account or Uday Mehta, and we will be taking them up and circulating them for the question and answers round. If any panelist or participant wants to intervene during the length of the webinar, please do so by raising your hand, and we will get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you, and I'd like to hand it over to Pradeep Mehta for moderating the event.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me first of all welcome everyone on behalf of CUTS, particularly our distinguished panelists, Honorable Suresh Prabhu, Honorable Pascal Lamy, Dr. Sanjay Barra, and Dr. Raja Mohan to this event, and including very distinguished participants that I can see in the audience as well. Now, contrary to a popular belief, the World Trade Organization is not facing any existential crisis. It was only in January this year at the World Economic Forum meeting in Davos that 18 of the 38 participating countries agreed to pursue a multi-party appeals arrangement for settling the trade dispute panel decisions until the WTO's appellate body is resuscitated. As you all know, I mean, the appellate body is in a coma. The US has not allowed the appointment of members. Now, more importantly, if you look at the current context, the huge disturbance which is taking place in our social, political, economic lives due to COVID-19, we expect that it is only going to unfold further. Things are so uncertain that we don't know what is going to happen. Over the last few years, global trade has faced a stressful time, and the COVID-19 pandemic is only exacerbating the same and adding to further challenges in cross-border trade as well. According to the various estimates, including by the WTO, and as supply chains got hugely disrupted in 2020, global trade will witness a massive negative growth by having huge implications on jobs and livelihoods. Therefore, it is imperative for the global trade community to see to it that the COVID-19 induced supply side shocks do not get spilled over much to the demand side. And that can be done provided we adhere to multilaterally agreed rules and regulations governing global trade. As we know, I mean, WTO has three major functions. One is to ensure transparency. This is done through the various committees of the WTO. Unfortunately, over the years, the functioning of the committees has weakened, primarily because of an overemphasis on the two other functions of the WTO, which are negotiations and dispute settlement. As we stand today, the multilateral trading system under the aegis of the WTO is facing a number of challenges, and they have to be addressed. sustainable economic development, including job creation, as enshrined in its preamble. Much of these challenges are emanating from the absence of political interest or political will on the part of majority of members who are unable to understand the values, which is shared security and prosperity that the WTO can bring as against the bilateral or regional trade agreements. Now, what did happen? One of the major problems in the past was the weakening of the WTO's committees, which also had its effect on the functioning of its dispute settlement body. The appellate body's decisions often went beyond their remit, resulting in distorted interpretation of trade rules. In future reform, the WTO dispute settlement body should restrict the functioning of its appellate body in a time-bound manner, and in respect to only those aspects of the relevant WTO agreements on which a dispute is raised. More importantly, the transparency function of the WTO should be strengthened by having some teeth and not just a tongue for its committees. This will require a close review of the built-in agenda of various WTO agreements, including the terms of reference of the WTO committees responsible for their implementation. The current system of the application of special and differential treatment, SNDTs, for developing and least developing countries is not working. One of the future activities of the WTO committee should be reorientation of SNDTs for facilitating trade as per the basic principles behind the WTO. And this should include an agenda to discuss trade adjustment programs vis-a-vis implementation outcomes of the WTO agreements. Now, there is a further need in our belief that we require a better informed political economy discourse in Geneva and other major capitals about the virtues of having a new kind of flexibility in the future trade agreements as per the needs and capacity of the WTO members. And there's an ideal example, the WTO agreement on trade facilitation, which has adopted new kind of flexibilities for developing and least developed countries. We are required to implement various provisions and sub-provisions of this agreement as per their needs and capacity, and as a result, a useful instrument for regional integration among other virtues. In sum, to conclude, while the existential crisis is not there, the WTO is experiencing a slippery slope, which may not improve as a result of the COVID-19 global pandemic. But it must be arrested and pushed forward. The Davos meeting was able to take steps in this direction. Nevertheless, it is time for the international trade community to reflect on the virtues of the multilateral trading system, including specific actions for reforming its various functions, to get them realigned with the WTO's basic principles or as outlined in the WTO's preamble. Among others, I would suggest three specific actions. One is creation of a critical mass of support for the EU-Canada proposal for reforming the WTO's dispute settlement system. Second, revival of the built-in agenda of the existing WTO agreements by advocating for greater transparency in the functioning of the WTO's committees. And finally, absorption of the values of the WTO's agreement on trade facilitation for future multilateral negotiations. With that, let me welcome you all once again and request Suresh Prabhu. Suresh bhai. Hello. Hello, is Suresh Prabhu there?
Hello?
Has Suresh Prabhu joined?
Yes. Yes, sir, he has joined.
Yeah, Suresh bhai.
Yes, I am there. I can hear you.
Good afternoon. would you like to kick off the... Thank you.
Thank you. So firstly, thank you very much, Pradeep, for organizing this very important event. And also, as everybody who is watching this program, Mr. Pradeep Mehta is unrecognizable with his new beard and his new looks. I think he is trying to wear that look deliberately to convince people that a new world is also going to be unrecognizable like this. And therefore, I really thank him for making this program with such a symbolic gesture like you have done. So thank you very much. As you mentioned, various aspects of the world global trading system. If you permit me, let me say that not just a trading related issues in global platforms are under serious threat, but multilateralism generally is also under very serious existential crisis. You'd like any multilateral institution which is becoming infructuous, ineffective, and therefore WTO is a very good symbol of understanding how ineffective the multilateralism is becoming. But I think we really need to look at how do we deal with this threat to multilateralism itself at a time when we need it the most. Just imagine, whether we like globalization, we don't like it, in context of market integration, in terms of opening borders, all those issues are little different. But look at today, why are we talking like this and not meeting in person? The pandemic has spread to more than 100 countries. It originated in China, but has gone all over the world. So whether you like it or not, we are already integrated in good way and bad way. So whether if somebody catches a sneeze, we'll catch a cold. And that is why we really need to now work more in closer cooperation than ever before. Also, when we are facing this huge financial economic crisis, worse than ever, I think we really need more global cooperation. And a global cooperation can come only through multilateralism. Coming to the very important issue that you raised is about WTO. I am really worried by the fact that there seems to be a very deliberate attempt to go and hit at the foundation of WTO itself by not allowing it to function, switching off the ventilator of WTO. And the ventilator of WTO is in terms of their ability to redress disputes. If the dispute redressal mechanism goes, nothing remains in WTO. It's only body, ineffective. So I think there is a deliberate attempt. And I could see that myself when I led India's delegation in December 2017 in Buenos Aires. And I saw to my own horror how callously they are dealing with global trading issues. So I announced there itself that if we could not agree on a ministerial in Buenos Aires, at least India will take a lead and call mini ministerial. So we called the first mini ministerial in March 2018, just as early as possible, and it was attended by 58 countries, 57, 58 countries. Idea was that at least we discuss together the issue that you raised and find out some workable solution. It cannot be anybody's argument that my way or no way. It should be somewhere meeting the ground by all countries finding out a very workable solution. And the second one we organized was again in March 2019, just 1 year after that. So we organized two, I chaired both, only with a view of solving this problem. In fact, the first, after mini ministerial, I had taken the heads of delegation to meet a Prime Minister. And Prime Minister also had told him that India stands committed to multilateralism and we'd like to work. Nobody denies that we need to reform WTO. Nobody. I don't think even WTO itself, if you ask them honestly, their own bureaucrats also will say, yes, we need to change. The question is, what is meaning of change? When you say reform, reform can be meant by anything. Is it a movement forward or is it going backward? We have seen after creation of WTO, the world has benefited immensely. Global opportunities have increased. I think to even emergence of China as a major economy, second largest now, could also be attributed to their joining WTO. Now the question is, the reform should be for making WTO better, global trading system better. And when we say better, from whose perspective you are looking at it? And as you correctly pointed out, the least developed countries, and even countries like India, which has a very unique characteristic. I said that in my intervention in Buenos Aires, that when we say special and differentiated responsibilities, India is absolutely a classic case of that. India is now close to $3 trillion economy, 2.9, so fifth largest, but at the same time, highest number of poor in the world live in India. So it's special in that sense, that it looks like a big economy, but we have also the challenges. So we must recognize that reality of the world when we are reforming WTO. We must ensure the interest of countries who are least developed as well as countries like India, which are aspiration to develop and facing so many challenges in achieving those goals. That part of the reality should be kept on table while discussing this. We had a very ambitious goal in Doha round. I said it little in a lighter vein, that why you call all these WTO discussions are round? I say because they go in round. So always they are round, but they don't come out with some solution. Doha round resulted in nothing, though we called it a development round. So I think now we should try to focus on development issues. At the same time, there are certain issues which other countries are raising are also relevant. I'm not saying they are completely irrelevant. We must sit on table and discuss this. But we must agree that there is a fundamental nature of WTO cannot be compromised. If we do that, it will actually help us to move forward. Like, and you talked about committees and others. The procedural aspect of WTO is also very important. I was asking my colleagues in WTO, what is the timeline for discussing an issue? They said there is no timeline. I said, we as politicians, we are elected to parliament, to the government with a timeline. All over the world this happens. But if WTO has no timeline for discussing an issue, how can it happen? So these are the procedural issues also need to be discussed. Then there are certain new world has emerged, whether we like it or not. The reality of new world also should be enshrined into WTO. So therefore, I am not saying the countries which are raising issues are irrelevant. I am saying they are very important. We must take those issues on board, but at the same time should not forget the basic structure why WTO has been created to begin with. And if we do that, I think we'll be able to move forward. Now the big challenge today, after 2008, Pradeep, you have made a lot of research on that. We have seen declining volumes and value of global trade as compared to the economic growth of the world. Economic growth, and if you look at a matrix before 2008 and after, you can clearly see it. Today in 2020, I feel the global trade is going to face the worst crisis. So what do we need? We need WTO more than ever. And therefore, I think we should focus on those issues, discuss in the multilateral platform, because that's the best way, it's a sustainable way. Because every country there has a voice, which helps the progress of the talks. Because if you don't have every country's voice heard, it can never be sustainable. Because you're talking about world trade, and the world consists of all the countries of the world. WTO starts with world. You cannot create an artificial world by eliminating certain countries or certain interests. So I think we should try to focus on that. And I think the next step would be, in my opinion, immediate. We should try to, some of the issues which already agreed, we should try to take them forward. But I think world economy can never take off without world trade growing. And world trade can never grow to is reform. It will make more functional, more effective, more efficient, more participatory, more forward-looking. I think these are the kinds of ingredients of the reform package we should have for WTO. And I think that is the only way we can move forward. There are many challenges in the world economy today, but they can be discussed only if you have a forum. And that is what multilateralism talks about. Discuss together, and that's what we like to do. So I think I'll stop here, and I will request you to continue with this mission of improving the world trading order by making WTO a far better, vibrant, forward-looking organization. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Suresh bhai. And this is just for the benefit of the audience and the other panelists, and that Shri Suresh Prabhu is also India's Sherpa to the G20 and G7. And that again is a multilateral forum on which much is dependent on us. Suresh bhai, there was a question asked that are you able to listen to me? Yeah, one question was asked that what is India's position on e-commerce and data privacy, etc. When in the G20 meeting in Osaka, there was a different stance taken as against what India is taking a stance at the WTO.
No, see, we are very clear about it, that we are in the process of formulating e-commerce policy. And same thing for data privacy issues. We have a legislation, draft legislation, which is already on the table. The parliament is, there is a special committee, of a special joint parliamentary committee, which is looking at it. In fact, I'm a member of that. And in fact, the draft economic policy, the e-commerce policy was made when I was a commerce minister, and I had set up a think tank, getting almost all stakeholders to come and debate. I think this is one of its kind.
Yeah, I was a member of it.
Yes, you are a member and very distinguished member. So I think, therefore, I am saying it's a work in progress. We are looking at those issues. In WTO, we had said that we are not opposed to e-commerce. When in Buenos Aires, we said only thing is that e-commerce is a business model. How much of that should be regulated through WTO or forum like that needs to be discussed. So this is what our stand was. So I think we are open to discussion on all issues, but we are saying that let us discuss at least the issues which have already been debated and discussed. So that when you take a new issue, it's absolutely necessary. But that doesn't mean that you will take new issues and forget the old one. So the old ones, the development issues also are very important. So I think we should not make room for a new issue to be taken up by discarding the old ones on the table.
Thank you very much. May I now request Pascal Lamy? Pascal? Hello, Pascal Lamy?
Sir, just a second, I'm just unmuting him.
Yes, if you are kind enough to unmute me, I'll be able to speak.
Yeah, please, welcome. Good morning.
Good to see you, Pradeep, in your new bearded incarnation. Thanks for organizing this discussion, and thanks for inviting me to take part. My basic point this morning will be, at least this morning where I am, will be that a multilateral rules-based open trading system will be even more challenged after the COVID crisis. That's my considered view, having participated in multiple discussions for the last 9 weeks on various places of this planet, digitally, of course. Before I get into that, a few points of clarification about what I mean by a multilateral rules-based open trading system. What I mean by open trade is that the name of the game is to reduce obstacle to trade in order to level the playing field so that different countries can play their comparative advantages. What I mean by rules-based is that it is done in a way that provides the players with a stable, predictable, enforceable legal standard, and that these rules are established following negotiations between trade partners, whether bilaterally, regionally, plurilaterally, or multilaterally, and this is where the WTO comes in. Of course, it does that in a global way, which means that it inevitably is the least common denominator that prevails, given that this is done by consensus. Obstacle to trade, and that's my experience, stem from basically two rationales. The first one is to protect domestic producers from foreign competition. This is protectionism. It's done through tariffs, subsidies, quantitative restrictions. That's one big family of obstacle to trade. And the other big family of obstacle to trade is what I call precautionism, which is not about protecting producers from foreign competition, but about protecting people from risks. And this is done through various regulations about safety, security, and these regulations may constrain market access, then become obstacle to trade. Now, turning to the challenges as I see them in the future. First, we already had serious challenges before the COVID crisis, and Mr. Prabhu expanded on that. They stemmed first from the fact that, yes, we had problems with protectionist measures coming from countries who pretend they are pro-open trade, but in reality find different ways to protect their domestic producers for purely political reasons, and there are vested interests, because opening trade makes the game more difficult for your domestic producers in some areas. It makes it easier in some areas, more difficult in others. And then, of course, came the US with Trump, whose doctrine is protectionist. We had previously people whose doctrine was open trade, but who were behaving in various ways that may contradict this doctrine, but Trump is openly protectionist, America first. And if you want to understand what it means, look at the op-ed which the USTR published in the New York Times on 11th of May, which is a perfect description of the doctrine behind Trump's trade policies, which of course resulted in a big offensive against WTO, and specifically against its major enforcement mechanism, which is the dispute settlement and the appellate body. That was before COVID crisis. The mega shock of the COVID crisis will make things worse in increasing obstacle to trade in mostly two areas. A massive state interventions in the economy with trillions and trillions of helicopter money coming into the production system, mostly manufactured from central banks or state coffers, and this will inevitably distort trade. State aids in such a magnitude will distort the competition, by the way, to the benefit of those who have big coffers and to the detriment of those who have small coffers. And then the second area will be, I believe, a steep increase in what I call precautionary measures, the safety, security, health, environment, de-risking of supply chains, some of which have been considered as too fragile during the crisis, security of sourcing, economic security, strategic autonomy, whatever you call it, and there's a huge worldwide conversation about this for the moment. The only good news, and that may matter for India, the only good news is that this crisis will result in a faster digitalization of this planet, hence of trade in services, which in a way is where India has a comparative advantage. So the challenge will be tougher, but the capacity to address this challenge will be weaker. As Minister Prabhu said, multilateralism was already in bad shape before the crisis, and it's going to be even worse. Has gone worse during this crisis, as we all know, with this exchange of bombs and accusations related to the crisis, to the origin of the crisis, to the way it has been handled. Then the North-South divide will increase. Poorer countries will have been disproportionately hit by this sanitary and economic crisis. So we will have a more fragmented, less multilateral capable world, which I think is another problem of the challenge, because if the difficulty is bigger and your capacity to address it is smaller, then it's a bigger problem. Finally, to conclude, a few policy prescriptions. It's all fine making the analytics, but the question is, what should we do? 3 time horizons in my mind: short-term, medium-term, long-term. Short-term, I think we should all strive to minimize trade restrictions, starting with food, where measures of restrictions are already in place in some countries, and this is a big danger for many countries. In some parts of this planet, people will die from starvation more than from the virus if food restrictions keep growing. So this is an immediate, serious risk, which I think the WTO should address. There is a coalition of members who recently decided not to recourse to food restrictions, and I think it would be a good thing if India could join this coalition. Another coalition which I think India could join, which is the one that the EU led to circumvent the US blockade on the appellate body. As you know, the US tried to take it hostage, and the EU found a patch with a provisional system which a number of WTO members have agreed they would use in order to take the hostage through the back door. That's for the short term. Medium term, I think, given the mega trade restrictions and trade distortions that will result from this crisis, we need a period of easing out. We need a period during which these measures, which are based on the necessity to address the huge economic and social shock of the crisis, will be progressively eased. And what I suggest is a sort of GATT-like code of conduct, the purpose of which would be to go back to open trade. And I would advise to do this with a coalition, and to call this coalition Co-op, which is the initials of Coalition for Open Trade, purpose of which would be to go back to a normal situation. And then long term, and that's my final point, long term, when the trade field is reasonably stabilized, and this will inevitably take time, then go back to WTO reform, which Mr. Prabhu mentioned, which means renegotiating the WTO rulebook. That's what WTO reform is about. And I see 3 areas where the WTO rulebook needs, and will need, but we only can be, in my view, be able to address that in a few years, which is number 1, trade and environment. The environmental constraint, climate change, global warming will become the number 1 problem for public opinions in the years to come. And India, by the way, is a big and major actor in this area. Second, discipline on state aid. We all know that the WTO rulebook is weak on subsidies, and that was a pre-COVID problem with China, whose state control of the economy is, as we all know, very large, hence a more or less well-founded suspicion that this means big public funding for exporters, hence distorting trade. And number three, and this has already been mentioned, including by your question to Minister Prabhu, digital trade, which following the And then the fourth thing that should be done, but this is not only WTO related, is that if I am right, that precaution is going to go up, then we need some sort of global system to level the playing field in precaution. This is very difficult because the level of precaution lies in the eye of the beholder. I published an interview in the Australian Financial Review just this morning about this. I think, notably for developing countries, a scattered, fragmented world as far as precaution is concerned is a big problem. Now, there's nothing like this in the international system for the moment. You have a few bits and pieces like Codex Alimentarius or the Global Animal Health Organization, which do that. But frankly speaking, this needs to be built from scratch. And I think we need a new global articulation between the trade people on the one side and the other side, the regulators that regulate safety, security, health, environment. And this dialogue should happen at global level in order to create some sort of leveling of the playing field, either by harmonization or by mutual recognitions. But let's recognize that this is a brand new and very complex and politically sensitive area. That's for the future.
Thank you, Pascal. Thank you very much. There was a question which was asked to you, which of course, I mean, what can WTO do immediately at this point of time, other than the fact is that it is going to soon be headless. I mean, rather to ask whether resigning, what is it that it can do immediately in order to give some kind of confidence to the global trading system?
I will answer two things. One, I already mentioned, which is prevent food export restriction. That's problem number one, and it is extremely urgent. And of course, to the detriment of poorer countries. As we know, in this sort of game, increasing my food security may make the food insecurity of my neighbor bigger. So that's a big problem. And second, be better at monitoring the trade measures during this crisis and those that will stem from the huge amount of money that will come as recovery plans develop. We are only at the start of this crisis. And the parallel with 2008 may be misleading, but we know from the 2008 crisis that finance, then economy, then social, then politics. We will have the same problem this time. Sanitary, then economic, then social, then political. The social shock of this crisis is in the making. It's not there. Although you have 30 million unemployed people in the US, which is totally unprecedented since the 1930s, the social shock is in the making. This will trigger a massive reaction in terms of recovery plans. This needs to be monitored. If we want the years following the crisis and the exit of the crisis to restabilize the trade system, how has it been destabilized needs to be monitored, needs to be acknowledged, needs to be discussed. Measures have to be notified, and this is where the WTO has a machinery for surveillance, monitoring, notification, which I think really needs to be upgraded in the month to come.
Thank you very much. May I invite Dr. Sanjay Baru? Sanjay, are you there?
Yeah, yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Welcome.
First of all, thank you for inviting me to join this discussion. We have heard two very important statements, one by former Minister for Trade, Mr. Suresh Prabhu, and by Pascal. I was sitting and recollecting the last time Pradeep, you, me, and Mr. Lamy were together in Bahrain, which was in 2012, when I organized a conference on multilateral trading system under the auspices of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. I recollected what we had been saying 8 years back. I think as both Mr. Prabhu and Mr. Lamy mentioned, the problem with the WTO, with the multilateral trading system, started after the 2008-2009 transatlantic financial crisis and the major economic setback that the West had had, and at the same time, the sharp rise of China during the first decade of this century and its continued rise. I think these two phenomena, on the one hand, the economic problems faced by the transatlantic economies, and on the other hand, the rise of China, posed an enormous challenge to the multilateral trading system. And we talked about this 8 years back. The problems have not gone away. The problems have only increased. And COVID has only made the situation worse. So I was a bit surprised when I saw the flyer for this afternoon's discussion begin with the first sentence, which said that, the talk about WTO being in an existential crisis is not correct. It is in an existential crisis. It is in an existential crisis because the global system that, in fact, put this multilateral system together, the major countries in the world, particularly the United States, is no longer defending the system. Mr. Lamy referred to the USTR article recently. The United States is no longer defending the multilateral system. The world does not have a response to, I like the phrase that Mr. Lamy used, precautionary measures taken. And which is a country that has taken enormous precautionary measures? It's China. And both the United States and China, the two biggest economies in the world, the two biggest trading powers in the world, have become increasingly protectionist and precautionary. So if you have a global trading system in which the biggest trading nations are increasingly protectionist and precautionary, and the WTO as an organization is being marginalized by the rise of regional and plurilateral groupings, which incidentally was the other subject of our discussion 8 years ago. And those plurilateral groupings have come and gone. TPP has come and gone. TTIP has come and gone. RCEP is still in the making. But the focus has been on plurilateralism, not on multilateralism. This brings me to the next set of questions. I don't want to repeat a lot of what has been said by both Mr. Prabhu and Mr. Lamy, and I entirely agree with a lot of what they have said. But let me move on to a second set of issues, which for me, as someone from India, looking at international trade is an extremely important issue, which is, what is our attitude to trade? In what way are we dealing with this new world, which is more protectionist and precautionary? I believe we have also decided to become more protectionist and precautionary. The language of trade, the trade discourse in India is no different today from what we hear in the United States, or indeed in many other parts of the world. So when so many major economies are becoming increasingly both protectionist and precautionary, the WTO has an existential crisis. How can we begin with the proposition that there is no existential crisis? And if Mr. Azevedo has decided to go home and do whatever he's doing, I don't blame him at all. He has no job to do in Geneva. It's a nice place probably to live. I have no idea, but I'm sure Rio de Janeiro is a nicer place to live. But the fact is, there is no work there. The organization is being starved of staff. The United States is not filling the vacancies in the court. So we have a major crisis, which has been long in making. As I said, the problem, the origins of the problem go back to 2008, 2009. And successive governments in India, both the Manmohan Singh government and the Narendra Modi government, have been dealing with the WTO in a period when the WTO is no longer interested in listening to India. And our response, as I just said a little while ago, has in fact been to also become more protectionist and precautionary. So I believe, COVID has actually physically disrupted movement. I mean, till now, the disruption was policy induced. Whether it is protectionism or precautionary interventions, these are policy induced disruptions to trade. Now we have actually physical disruption to trade. The ships don't move, the planes are not adequate, the trains are not moving, except China, which has sent a train all the way from Beijing to Berlin, carrying medical equipment. The fact is that goods are not any longer moving at the same pace. So given all of this, I actually think we are in a serious global crisis as far as trade is concerned, which calls for a new global initiative. We are back where we were at the time of the creation of GATT, which is immediately after the Second World War. In a sense, the way I look at COVID from a trade point of view is COVID is doing to trade exactly what the Second World War did to trade, which is to physically disrupt trade. And how did the world respond to that physical disruption of trade that the Second World War contributed to? It responded to it by creating a new trading regime under the tutelage of the United States, under the leadership of the West. But today, that new system will have to be created under a leadership which the West will have to share with other trading nations. And India has to play a positive role, because India is not going to grow at 9%, 8%. Mr. Suresh Prabhu, as Minister for Industry and Commerce, started a project for making India a $5 trillion economy. We are not going to be a $5 trillion economy as an inward-looking economy. For us, trade is extremely important, because we are dependent, continue to be dependent in a variety of areas on the global market. So let me end by saying, Pradeep, that I'm glad you've taken this initiative to start this conversation, but this conversation can only progress if we, one, recognize that we are in a crisis. The WTO is an existential crisis. Two, that there has to be a new global compact, which is cognizant of new global power relations. You have to take into account China's power. You have to take into account the fact that there are other developing countries which aspire for more balanced and a more development-focused trading regime. And you also have to take into account the fact that the West, which has dominated the system, is no longer in a position to dominate. So some element of accommodation from the point of view of the West. So we are really, in my judgment, talking about a new post-COVID global trading system that has to come out of the shambles in which the WTO now is.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sanjay. With that, Raja is my co-moderator in a sense. So we're going to open the floor. But Sanjay, just to answer your last point, in fact, I and Pascal had written an article together long ago, taking forward his theory about Plan B, which is to have a WTO without the US, if that is what is stopping multilateralism. Now, if those of you might remember 1948 Havana Charter had an ITO framework, an international trade organization, and it was actually rejected by the US Congress that we cannot multilateralize our sovereignty. Now, this is at the heart of what is happening again today. That you're looking at issues whether you think that if your sovereignty is going to be multilateralized in this way, how far you can accept it or how far you cannot go. Of course, there are other issues also. Things are complex. It's not just one issue. The fact is that China has been able to use WTO to a large extent to do what it is, and as Pascal also pointed out, that the kind of state corporations or state-owned enterprises, the way it is being supported, was able to expand its share of the market in a huge way and in a manner in which could not be challenged. So that is one, I would say, a sensible grouse as far as the US is concerned. Yet it doesn't give any reason for any country to reject the multilateral system. May I request Suresh Bhai to please Suresh Bhai?
Viewpoint, very important and very relevant to this discussion. One is what
I have unmuted him. He's not.
मैंने unmute किया था वो तुमसे तुम्हारे से हुआ हाँ
मेरे से भी unmute हुआ.
Why one very important point with my friend Dr. Sanjay Baru said is very important that to be a $5 trillion economy, we must have an integration with the global market more than ever before, because there is a historical evidence that the countries who achieved very high rates of growth in a short period of time, and many of them are in Asia and some of them are our neighbors, would happen only because of that one reason. So now we have to find out a complementarity between growing domestically, as the Prime Minister has given a very important call of Atmanirbhar Bharat, in which we have to be marrying both in a manner that a global economy will grow, a global footprint will grow, at the same time our domestic economy will grow with that as a driving force. Now to do that, one of the very key point will be membership of WTO, which we already have because we are also member of GATT even before WTO was born. But what is important now is that we must have a very active role in ensuring that we use our geopolitical clout to use geo-economic as a driving force for developing the new global order. At a time when the global institutions are virtually, as I said, initially becoming very ineffective, I think we could start with WTO and then take on to other institutions so that multilateralism will become a driving force. But WTO could be a starting point. And as Mr. Pascal Lamy said, I fully agree with him. It comes with so much of experience that if you don't do today anything immediately, it is too late in the day. Because after some time, we'll lose steam and then we'll lose the plot completely. I personally feel that every country has to give in something for a larger good. Because you look at it like this, as we do in the climate change, we always do a very interesting scenario, business as usual approach. What would happen if the greenhouse gas emissions are emitted in normal course? And therefore, why action is necessary? Because what disastrous consequence it will have. I think we must also prepare a scenario like this for global trade. Suppose there is no WTO. Today we are saying that WTO is this, WTO is that, we can always abuse them. But what happens if there is no WTO? How will you carry on trade? And in any case, when Mr. Dunkel was preparing those drafts for WTO, we had made really, I would say, a prophetic comments on what would happen if it doesn't happen. So today, I think we should try to look at it like this. People are saying WTO has so many ills, is okay, all accepted. But what happens in the absence of WTO? What will happen to global trade? What will happen to global economy? So I think that scenario should be the guiding principle. And in any case, I have seen that some country or other has benefited. Some are obviously benefited more by WTO than the rest. But the argument could be that if there was no WTO, even in the past, would global economy would have grown so much? So one is the past perspective and one is a future guidance about what happens without WTO. And very clearly, there will be a chaos, honestly. we can really go back to the days of piracy when the trade was carried out with all attendant risk, when there was no regulatory body. I think we should really therefore work on very aggressive agenda for WTO, and that is what India tried to do. And therefore I give examples of two major mini-ministerial we organized. Incidentally, Mr. Pascal Lamy will also tell you, the mini-ministerial normally has about 20-25 countries. In mini-ministerial that we organized in March 2018, there are 58 countries, or 57, maybe one I'm missing out. But that many countries participated. Why? Because we requested, I called most of the ministers personally, requested that please come, let us find out a way forward. So I think this is what we need to do immediately.
Thank you. Pascal?
Okay, thanks for the mic. First, there has to be some sort of articulation between the WTO as well as and the G20. And by the way, and I know that from experience, the DG of the WTO sits at the G20, like his colleagues from the International Labour Organization, the World Bank president, the IMF managing director, because there is a strong need for coordination between major international organizations. I prefer to call them institutions, but diplomats don't like me talking about international institutions. They prefer to call them organizations because they believe this should be member-driven. As you know, from my European experience, I came to the view that member-driven organizations were in danger of bumping into walls, and whereas institutional organizations have a better resilience. That's another story. So the problem being that this time, the level of G20 coordination is incredibly low. If there is one distinctive feature of this COVID crisis for the last 80 years, basically since the end of the Second World War, it is that the level of international cooperation is incredibly low. Look at the polemics about the World Health Organization. Look at the fact that the G7 could go nowhere, and look at the very weak coordination of the G20. So this is a sort of one more feature of this analytical description which we made, and which I think we'll agree on, which is that multilateralism was not in bad shape before the crisis, and is even in a worse shape now. And I must say, I like Professor Sanjay Barra's sort of analogy with the post-Second World War. I think one of the big questions for the years to come is whether we today are in a post-World War II situation, or whether we are in a post-2008 financial crisis situation. And there are views on different sizes, which have to do with the magnitude of the impact of this crisis on production systems. Can they restart rapidly? In which case, the destruction will be limited. So we are more in a sort of 08 crisis than the World War crisis. About the impact on the social systems, it may be that we are more on a World War II scenario, post-World War II scenario. And I think all this has enormous consequences on trade. And I will defend Pradeep putting the sentence that there is no existential crisis. There is a WTO crisis. There is a global crisis. There is a WTO crisis. I think what he means by there is no existential is that we should not doubt from the necessity of a lively existence of a world trading system. And on this, I would side with him.
Thank you. Thank you, Pascal. There's one question, Lamy. a couple of questions to you. First is, does trade help to get out of the crisis, or can trade help to get out of the crisis resulting from COVID-19? If yes, how? If not, what will be the fate of the WTO? And let me ask you a second question. How will we make sure that short-term advantages don't outweigh a long-term perspective?
On the first question, I think we will need open trade as a transmission belt of the recovery of the economies. Let's assume China is now back to business, that quite soon Europe, then US, then countries like India will be back to business. This will happen with a sort of sequence, with the first parts of the train getting out first, and then the rest following. So if this is to happen, we need the oiling of open trade to be there, including, by the way, which have dried up during the crisis. So short term, keeping trade open, removing trade restrictions that have been put in place during the crisis is a contribution to the recovery. And if we do that together, the global recovery will be faster than otherwise. On the second question, I mean, it's a permanent problem for any politician on this planet that global issues and long-term issues are not what the voters look at. Politics are short-term and local, whereas a lot of problems are long-term and global. We diagnose this north-south, east-west with the Oxford Mountain report in 2012-2013, about which is called Now for the Long Term, where we identified a number of challenges. And I reread it recently, including the paragraph which mentioned COVID as a possible problem. So we had some sort of long-term view. And I think I totally agree that, I mean, our systems, our political systems, and especially in democratic systems, are not good enough at dealing with long-term issues. Maybe a shock like the one we've had because of obvious non-preparedness by all countries will tell us the lesson that we have to prepare better. And in order to prepare better, we have to look better at futures on the plural, because there's nothing like one future. Maybe that may be a positive consequence of this crisis.
Pascal, a question to you from me again. As you pointed out, Navarro has written an article also in questioning the need for the US to continue to remain in the WTO. And I mentioned this a little while earlier also. This is an idea that you had also floated. After all, US is not the best kind of international citizen. In many areas, it is not a party to the International Criminal Court and so on and so forth. Do you think, would that be a good way to save multilateralism from being doomed, at least multilateral trading system being doomed?
Yes, yes, definitely, Pradeep. Although this is only Plan B.
Yeah,
Plan
right.
A should remain, keeping the US in the tent. We will see what happens with the November elections. It may change the stance of the US vis-à-vis WTO, although it probably will not change much the stance of the US vis-à-vis China, because the notion that China is now a systemic geopolitical, geoeconomic, tech rival is deeply entrenched into the US political system. But as far as multilateralism, as far as what does it mean to serve US interests in the global system, elections could change a few things. This being said, I remain of the view, and we, as you said, shared it together, that if the US try to take the WTO hostage, we have to have a plan, that, which is plan B, that makes the system work without the US the time they understand that a global system is not as bad for them as Mr. Trump pretends it is. And by the way, this is why I supported, advocated the solution the European Union has put together to circumvent the US blockade on the appellate body. And I would consider it rational and wise for India to join this coalition, which so far it has not done because of US pressures.
Thank you. Sanjay, can I, there's a question to you. What is your opinion about the US remaining inside the WTO or outside the WTO? You know, there is a bill which has been moved also in the US Congress, the lower house.
I mean, these are the world's biggest economies. What multilateralism are you talking about if both the US and China stay out of it? And if the United States stays out of it, many other countries may also stay out of it for a variety of reasons. So, you know, a multilateral system has to be all in one. Certainly all in one as far as US and China are concerned and other major economies.
Yeah, you know, on the same point, can I ask Suresh Prabhu, you know, the US has resigned from the climate change agreement. Has it impacted the climate change agreement or multilateralism at large or not? What is your view on it?
Actually, I will just say, put it like this, and because we call it World Trade Organization. So if you have got a World Football, FIFA, we say that the top 3-4 teams will not participate in it and will play the FIFA. Because as everybody is saying, that European Union, US, China, ASEAN, India, put together, they are the major trading blocs. They are the major economies. European Union also a very strong trading bloc. So we cannot exclude them. Otherwise, we can say Brazil, Argentina, France, and Italy cannot play the World Cup football next time onwards. So it will not be a World Cup anyway. So I think we should try to make sure that we have an agreement in which all participate. And as Dr. Sanjay was saying, I call him Sanjay, is my friend, but Dr. Sanjay Barra was saying that, you know, together they have 40% of the global output, the US and China together. So I think this is something very important, that we cannot ignore the reality of life. But at the same time, that efforts should be, again, I repeat that point, and I think my dear friend Mr. Lamy will agree, that only way we can do it is not in the ministerial, the big ministerial. That is, every country comes and they just make a stated position, as we happened in Buenos Aires when it collapsed. So have smaller round, talk to people, and one thing, and someone like, I mean, all the top economists are here. Sanjay Baru is there, Mr. Lamy, and you are there, and I think Raja is also there, who cannot I see on the screen. But if we can prepare some paper, what happens if there is no WTO? That would be the reality people will then understand, including my friends in those who are opposed to WTO today. They will understand then, oh my God, we cannot have something like this. So we must therefore bring together on table everybody. But I fully agree that it cannot be an exclusive agreement by excluding some countries. It should be an inclusive agreement by taking everybody on board. But every country must be able to cede certain points so that we have a larger agreement.
My question, you're not...
Pradeep, can I come in for a minute?
Yeah, sure.
No, I just wanted to, I thought the point that just came in, what Sanjay said and what you said, can we have a WTO without the US or China? It's like, of course, Hamlet without the Prince of Denmark. But the fact is, there was a world in which we had the two superpowers had the separate trading arrangements. There was the GATT, in which Soviet Russia was not part of it. There was a Comecon, which Russians were running with their own socialist division of labor, if you will. So it is not entirely new. And I think the judgment here is not that you can't have a WTO without either of them, is whether the current state of the US-China relationship can sustain a framework in which it works for both of them. So what the Americans are saying is, look, the thing is not working for us, though it was Americans who created it. It was the Americans who brought the Chinese in 30 odd years ago and said, look, this is fantastic to have the Chinese in. It benefited everyone. And now the Americans are saying it is not working for us. So therefore, if the talk of decoupling is serious, then I think we are in a world in which both sides might feel that they got to do something. But we are not there yet. But the fact is, take the BRI, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative, the single largest economic initiative outside the Bretton Woods institutions. China is already building an alternative institution. Now, whether that can replace WTO is not the question. But at this point, it is three levels at which the WTO is under stress. One, in the domestic politics of the United States, the people are saying it does not work for the working classes of the United States. Now, long ago that the jobs are going to move to China and Mexico. Therefore, today you need to rearrange the system, which is what the Americans are saying. Now, that argument, I think even Democrats, as Pascal was saying, that if Democrats come to power, they're already moving to the left. That they're saying, look, we're not going to sign any more free trade agreements. So I think there is a shift in the domestic politics in the United States. And I think we have to come to terms with it, whether we like it or not. The second aspect is that the US-China conflict, which Sanjay talked about, that the structural change of rise in China and China's domination of the global economy, for example, we can't have just one factory in the world or one pharmacy in the world. That's fine, as long as everyone trusts that pharmacy and that factory. Today, what's happened is that you can't rely on one pharmacy, American people are saying. Now, can you rely on one factory? So if the trust is broken down, the system is under stress. So I will just stop here, my initial thing. Is it a crisis or an existential crisis? The very fact that Pradeep has talked about a resurrection is somebody pulling out from the dead. So we're probably close to dead. But till, I think, as Mr. Lamy said, look, there is a way of reviving this dead body or a half-dead comatose body. And that requires political action. I think no point talking about rules at this point or procedures within the WTO. Is there a room for a few countries to politically get together, put the political capital on the line and salvage the system? Because the Americans are talking about shorter supply chains, creating alternative mechanisms. The Chinese are doing their own thing. So if there is a friends of WTO at this point, that the need is to create a group that at least takes the political initiative to salvage the best parts of it, while hoping that the domestic politics in the US and China are not going to make it even worse in the coming years.
Raja, thank you very much. China is not such a problem, and insofar as multilateralism is concerned, they're supporting it. Now, whether their support is good or bad, best for the world or not, is not the issue. US today it has only about 9% share of the world trade. It's not even a very big trader in that sense. It may have a large economy, but the economy is going to go down. My question to the panel was, and including to Suresh Bhai, was that, they have remained outside. They've resigned from the climate change agreement, which is a much more serious agreement as far as the humanity is concerned, the way climate change is taking place and so on. So can I come back to Suresh Bhai on this issue about US withdrawing from the climate change agreement, and what would be the impact on climate as well as on multilateralism?
Firstly, just if you permit me, just one point what Raja was saying and Mr. Lamy was saying, that smaller groups should get together and discuss the issue. That is what mini minister is all about. In fact, we get these smaller groups to come and talk about it. That's why we organized. In fact, the first one we organized was large one, 58 countries, so that then we organized a smaller one. The whole idea was the same, that we bring together the like-minded parties, try to focus on the issues, articulate them properly, and then take it to the larger group. So I think this is what we need to continue, which I was also saying. I fully agree that we must meet in different interest groups, try to talk about bring consensus and then take it forward. As far as the climate change is concerned, there is one, both are multilateral undoubtedly. But let's just tell me a very subtle difference between the two. Trade, by definition, has to have a counterparty. I cannot do trade with myself. I cannot say that I am only transferring from left pocket to my right pocket and I say that I have done international trade. It is not possible. So therefore, in trading order, we have to have more countries involved. In climate change, we have a very interesting situation that a global emissions must reduce for global climate to change. So therefore, we want global agreement. But global emissions will never change unless local emissions also stop. So it's a very unique situation in which local action is also necessary, whereas global action is also called for. Take an example of US. While US nationally have walked out of Paris Accord, but the states like California are putting more restrictions than probably any other state. In fact, California is a very large economy. It would have been a country in itself, would have been one of the top 5 economies. So it's that action locally is happening. So what happens actually in climate change, we definitely need global agreement. In fact, when again talk about G20, the 19 countries, when the last summit took place in Osaka, this is the first time we have a formulation called 19. Feel like this is that now is a clear-cut link between the climate change and its impact on economy, on social life. Just imagine if the climate change becomes far more serious matter, the emissions goes up, how many refugees will be there? The climate refugees. The Europe is facing big problem of refugees coming because of political uncertainty. If the climate refugee happens, what happens to India? What happens to so many other countries? So I think climate change is no longer an academic or scientific discussion issue. It's a real life issue, has to be acted upon. And sadly, I would say that thanks to leadership of India, actually, Prime Minister Modi that time was talking to President Obama and President Hollande on the other side because it was held in Paris, and they could actually agree on a very good accord. I feel personally that we must revisit that accord. It's not the best one, but at least it's a good workable accord to work with. I think we should try to make it operational. And I'm making a very bold statement. People like it or not, but effect of biodiversity is also one of the cause why we are getting new and new pandemics coming out. Whether we like it or not, there is actually a reality because of loss of habitat, because of biodiversity loss. The impact of biodiversity loss is unimaginable. Nobody can say that you lose 5% biodiversity, so impact will be 2.5%. It is not like that. It is phenomenal because you are actually changing the entire ecosystem on which you don't have a full control. So therefore, in a situation like this, climate change should be put on a priority along with the trade agreement. This could be the two big building blocks for multilateralism. And therefore, I think we should try to work on it. I fully agree. So this should be the top priority for the world to revisit some of these existential issues that humanity, as well as in case of climate change, even the entire biological life is facing. In case of pandemic, probably we are facing only human life, but in climate change, we are facing even biological life.
Thank you very much, Suresh bhai. Pascal, what is your view on this debate? Number one. Number two is a question which has been asked by somebody in the audience is whether in the event of a multilateral trading system being in a bad spot, would it be advisable for countries to enter into regional trade agreements?
But on the first question,
I'll come to you, Suresh bhai.
On the first question, Pradeep, when I was DG of the WTO, I initiated the first WTO UNEP Trade and Environment report. And I remember at the time, I took this initiative and I had some problems, including with India, by the way, for having pushed environment as a trade issue. Now, I deeply believe that these two things are very connected, that they all have to do with the functioning of a global market capitalist system, and that the urgency of addressing the climate crisis will have an impact on the price of carbon, which, like all changes in relative prices, will have an impact on trade. Now, the question, that's this global analytics. The question is, how can trade policy, disciplines, systems can contribute to an acceleration of the climate transition? And this is a very difficult issue because, as Minister Prabhu just said, these are two different buildings in the international system, the communication of which are very rare. Because the culture of trade people is not about environment, and second, because the culture of environment people is not about trade. So there has to be a cooperative approach. This will take time, notably because for a long time, the price of carbon will be different from constituency to constituency, and there will be a need of systems that address this problem of carbon pricing differences, including border carbon adjustment systems, which in my view will happen in line with WTO rules. And it's very important that any border carbon adjustment system fits with that. The Institut Jacques Delors in Brussels, which is called Europe Jacques Delors, will publish on the 3rd of June a new template for an EU system And so this is an area where I think more activity, more discussion, more coordination will have to take place. As far as the second question is concerned, we've always had multilateral, regional, bilateral, unilateral trade measures. I've always been of the view that, contrary to what many very respected academics say, there is no contradiction between opening trade unilaterally, bilaterally, regionally, multilaterally. If you look at the facts and not the theory, trade distortions emanating from preferential trade agreements are very little. So on this, I am on the side of the Chinese proverb. I don't mind the color of the cat, provided it catches mice. So whatever way of opening trade that reduces obstacle to trade is a good way forward.
Thank you. Sanjay?
Or Pradeep, if I might just come in just
please.
1 second before Sanjay comes in. I think saying the world is interdependent, therefore we're going to get a collective solution. I mean, that doesn't work because, for example, we said nuclear weapons are a threat to everyone. Have we agreed to eliminate them? No. So if climate change is a common threat, does not mean countries will automatically come together. Because the problem has been the distribution of costs. How do you distribute the costs of rearranging the global economy? And which then takes you into the internal distribution of the costs, where competing groups within each country say, look, it doesn't work for me, it works for me. And that's where the struggle has been. So I think the problem is, how do you harmonize the interests of sovereign states, out of which many are responsible for their own domestic public opinion, to rearrange a global economic system, which is what we are talking about. There, I think, in democracies at least, like India too, has walked out of RCEP. You can talk about free trade, we are committed to multilateralism, but we walked out of free trade because we felt a threat from a particular quarter, which you say now that I can't do this anymore. So I think there's no point saying we are interdependent, therefore we're going to find solutions. The focus must be on how do you harmonize the interests of multiple states amidst a significant cost that is involved in re-engineering, whether it's in dealing with climate change, or today, where between US and China, how are you going to rearrange the global trading system? I think that's where the political trick is, and that is going to be the most difficult one.
Thank you. Sanjay?
Yeah, well, look, let's face it. multilateral institutions are relationships of power. Multilateral arrangements are relationships of power. That is ABC of international relations. So in any regime, whether it's the non-proliferation regime, climate change, trade, whatever regime you take, power relations impinge on the outcome of that regime. The fact is that up to a certain point, the world trading system reflected the power of a certain set of countries. Power equations are changing, and therefore these institutions are getting shaken up. Now, when the United States says that these changes do suit me, and therefore I will opt out, we can take two positions. We can take the position that, for example, India took when it opted out of the non-proliferation regime. It said that here is a nuclear non-proliferation regime that does not suit me, so I opt out. But we paid a price. The powerful countries impose sanctions on us for opting out. Question today is, if the United States opts out of the WTO, does the international community have the stomach, have the means to impose costs or not? If it does not have the ability to impose costs, the United States may well stay outside the WTO. As you yourself said, trade is only 9% of the GDP. They may bring in a few countries and run their own plurilateral, which is precisely what TTP was about, or TTIP was supposed to be about, or now RCEP as far as China is concerned. So plurilateral arrangements came up, the idea came up precisely because the big I'm an Indian. I look at it from my point of view. I believe India is better off with the multilateral system rather than a plurilateral regime dominated either by China or by the United States. I would like a multilateral system. So I will try. I may not succeed, but I should try. As Mr. Prabhu correctly said, he convened a meeting of for 45, 50 trade ministers a couple of years back. India and other like-minded countries, whether it's France or Japan, other like-minded countries should come together and try, and then see whether the United States and China are willing to be part of that alternative regime, which addresses everybody's interest better than whatever WTO is able to do. That is power. I mean, power is central to all agreements. It's not only in one set of agreements that you have power relations impinging and that they don't impinge on other agreements.
Thank you, Sanjay. There's a question raised by Minister Prabhu to all the panelists that should a foreign company be given specific incentives to invest in a country the way China has been doing? Pascal, would you like to take this question?
No, I mean, of course, but I will answer it and then I'll make a point about multilateralism because I'm not sure I agree with part of what has been said. On China, I think things are much simpler than what I hear very often. China joined the WTO, and that was a great thing both for China and for the rest of the world. This notion that China joining the WTO was a mistake is not. Just look at the numbers. Before China joined WTO, its external trade surplus was 10% of the GNP. Today, it is less than 1%, which means that for the 20 years we've had China in the WTO, imports in China have grown more than exports from China. This is a good win-win deal. Now, this being said, China joined a system who was very imperfect. The WTO rulebook is solid in some areas and weak in other areas. And where the WTO rulebook is weak, very weak, is on disciplines on subsidization. Did China abide by its commitment? Yes, it did. Do the rules of WTO properly constrain a number of Chinese investment, export, subsidization incentives? No. So the problem is not that China did not abide by the rules. The problem is that the rules are weak in a number of areas where China has developed unfair trading advantages. And this is why we need to go back to the rule book. And this is why we will need to do that post-COVID, after a period where basically everybody has behaved like China in pumping massive state money in the economy. And this problem of cohabitation, of global market capitalism with what China called Chinese specificities, which is 1/3 of the economy under state command, needs to be addressed because this is not a proper level playing field. The point I want to make about multilateralism is a reaction to this notion that international cooperation is about power gains. I do not agree 100% with that. There is a part of international cooperation which is in the hands of sovereigns, diplomats, treaties, institutions, inter/national systems between nations. This is one part of it. But there is a whole other part of the international system and cooperation, which is in the hands of other actors than states. Businesses, NGOs, big academic. This is much less relevant to trade than it is to environment or to tech or to health or to development, because on the trade side, the question is about regulating and disciplines, and this is in the hands of sovereigns. But we have to complement a multilateralism, which for the moment is in crisis, by what I call polylateralism. Multilateralism is about states' agreements globally. Plurilateralism is about states agreeing in some lower formats than the global one. Polylateralism is international cooperation between states, NGOs, cities, businesses. And if you want to understand the difference, look at the composition of the UN Security Council and look at the composition of the Global Fund Board. The one is inherited from the 19th century globally. The other is a 21st century HIV/AIDS fighting institution, organization, and it's organized in a much more diverse way. So we also have to go in this direction. This is what I'm promoting as a chair of the Paris Peace Forum. And by the way, we have a big Indian think tank, which is part of the founding system of the Paris Peace Forum, which is RIS. So if more Indian organizations, including us, would like to join Open Door, although founding members are now defined. But I think this is also a way to go, although I agree that in trade, polylateralism, which is international cooperation based on coalitions, on projects, on stakeholders engaging in getting things done, is less relevant than it would be in environment, in tech, in culture, and in other areas of multilateral cooperation.
Thank you. I mean, before we conclude, there is one question to all the panelists or anybody in the panel who would like to, what would be your view on the changing structure of global value chains in the world in the post-COVID environment?
I'll just say a few points on that.
Please.
You cannot bring a global value chain changes by any multilateral order. It happens actually through some sort of a business transactions. when a private sector company wants to source certain products for his end product, he will obviously work out cost benefit analysis. He will find out the natural advantage of sourcing from a particular place. So I think to change the value system, when I say value system, is not the values as we understand, but a value related to business value chain. In other words, the values are completely different. You cannot change the value chain again by any trading order, but probably by some spiritual order. But this value chain, the global value chain or the global supply chain, will definitely undergo some key changes. Countries have advantage when there is a disruption of existing value chain. There is a possibility of somebody coming in. India has an advantage. We should try to capitalize on it. But as we are saying that this will happen through companies in their boardrooms making the decisions about what makes sense for them. The governments can play a key role in facilitating it. For example, we created a very good hub for auto components. We created a very good hub for generic drugs. I think we should try to focus on making certain natural advantage where we enjoy certain products and try to give amenities, facilities. So we will scale it up to a level wherein we'll also become part of a global supply chain through private sector companies. Government job will be to facilitate creating infrastructure, enabling atmosphere, providing fiscal benefits. That's what we can do.
Thank you.
On this, Pradeep,
Yeah.
Well, first, I think there will be some marginal reconfiguration of some supply chains. We already, by the way, had that following the US-China tech divide and decoupling promoted by the Trump administration. We will have this in other areas like medicines, drugs, medical equipment, because of the what the COVID crisis revealed of the fragility of this sort of sourcing routes. Will have a slightly different organization of globalization following diversification of supply chains, following some reshoring, and by the way, probably not have to mention the proper way of increasing some of the security of the supply chains, which is inventories. You don't need to reshuffle a whole system in order to make it more safer. You sometimes just have to accept to pay the cost of inventories. I participated in a conversation of this kind at the OECD a few weeks ago, where a very clever US academic said, we have to move from just in time to just in case. And I like this because I think it says a lot about this problem. Now, I agree very much with Minister Prabhu that this is first and foremost something for firms, for companies, for producers to organize themselves, especially in the manufacturing sector, which is more fragile than the services sector. It's mostly a question of firms reorganizing some of their supply and production systems. But I also suspect that some states, some sovereigns will want this to happen, not least to address the political demand from their constituencies that my system has to be made economically safer. I need more economic security. And this is one of the versions of the point I made on precaution, and which Professor Sanjaya Barra agreed with. This hardening, it's a bit like military equipment. You use a mobile phone, I use a mobile phone. When I speak to a guy who's fighting somewhere, his mobile phone is not the same as mine. His mobile phone has been hardened. It's more costly, it's more sophisticated, it's more resilient to shocks. This is what will happen in some areas. My basic point is that whereas this will happen, I think it should happen openly. What sovereigns want to do, the measures they use to harden some of these precautionary hardening of supply chains has to be put on the table. It has to be coordinated. It has to be notified. It has to be monitored. So my advocacy on this is please move to a transparent way of doing things. This is the way to go. And I've always said and thought that transparency is the basic level of international governance. If you put the information on the table, if you tell the others what you do, what you intend to do, there is a sort of self-coordination that will happen without big bureaucratic processes. I think this is the way to go.
Thank you very much, Sanjay.
Look, Pradeep, I think, in India, we have far too much discussion about global value chains and not real action. We are not part of any global value chain. Most foreign investment coming into India has come so far mainly for either the domestic market or single point export. And unless we have a clarity on our relationship with a whole range of countries, I mean, you take the RCEP decision, whatever the factors that may have motivated us to stay out of the RCEP. Today, any company walking out of China, why should it come to India and not go to, say, Vietnam or to Indonesia? Because locating themselves in countries which are members of RCEP, even if they're outside of China, they remain within a certain market. The moment they come to India, they're outside of that market because we are not members of RCEP. So I think we have not had enough thinking on global value chains. There's a lot of academic discussion that goes on. As far as policy is concerned, the Indian trade policy has not addressed the issue of whether we want to be integrated with global value chains or not. So it's a purely academic discussion. On the ground, right now, the focus is only on manufacturing for the domestic market or single point units that manufacture for the export market, like Lockheed Martin exports from its Hyderabad base to the United States, or Hyundai exports from Chennai to Africa. You have these kind of value chains are concerned in India is internal. Moving goods from Hyderabad to Bombay, from Delhi to Calcutta is a huge global domestic value chain problem that we need to be addressing first.
Thank you. Raja?
Yeah, thanks, Pradeep. I mean, I think before you close, I thought I'll just respond to some of the things Mr. Lamy was saying earlier. And more broadly, the problem that we have, I think, on the multilateralism front, I mean, not just WTO, much broader one. I think certain assumptions were made at the beginning of 1990s. Somehow the end of the Cold War and the end of hostility between the major powers has opened up space for international capital that actually states don't matter. The capital can actually negotiate rules for easy movement, shape the rules in other countries, and that the free movement of capital and labor would actually rearrange the global economy on a far more efficient basis, where you can do production where it is cheapest, move it to markets where there is demand. So therefore, a natural economic, a globalization of capitalism, if you will. But I think it's ran into two obstacles, I think, we've seen. One, the state did not die. I mean, whether in Europe, where a regional project, or in the global level, the state is very much alive. You remember, we used to talk about Google and Apple are going to take over the world, the state doesn't matter. Today, everyone wants to regulate those agencies. So this idea of state was a 19th century invention, and we are in 21st century where Bill Gates will run global health. I think we created an illusion for ourselves, and that the state is back. And when the two most important states can't get along, they're contesting the structure in multiple ways. So I think the state is back, whether domestically, the surveillance state, which has taken all the techniques from surveillance capitalism, and the state has adopted norms which are quite severe in a way. So therefore, the state is going to regulate and is interstate, national, that is going to come back, and not this idea of a supranational, transnational institutions like the EU or the UN, which are going to fix every problem in the world. That world has disappeared in front of our eyes. And I think we got to come to terms with it. I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing, but that's a fact that we have to deal with. The second problem that we run into global capitalism is there's wretched politics in each country. So this idea that capital has transcended politics and that everybody is for globalization, everybody is benefiting from this, as we know from the US politics, as we know from British politics, as we know in Indian politics, that's not been true. So those discontents within each country are questioning the benefits and politicians are responding to it. I mean, now that politics within each state, particularly the major states, has an impact on how we organize multilateralism. And I think here, as people are saying, are societies just economic units of efficiency? Are they communities with some shared values that I don't want suddenly in one lifetime, the entire environment around me changing, the people who are next door to me, everything changes in less than one lifetime. So I think that question, look, are we building communities? Are we building economic efficiency? So I think people are going back to the notion of communities. So when India talks about, as the North Indians would say, Atmanirbhar Bharat, that there is a different approach to globalization today that is beginning to unfold. And I think that again is a problem. So therefore, the reconciliation of new challenges that have come, so in many ways, we're going back to the 20th century, I think. So there is going to be competitive multilateralism. It's not a question of whether multilateralism is dying or alive. It's a question of there are going to be multiple ideas of what is the best possible multilateralism. And the US-China competition is going to intensify that. And the US today openly talking about building supply chains within friendly partner countries. That includes Europe and India. Democracy sometimes we include Vietnam and say forget democracy. So therefore the idea that you can create alternative structures and plurilateral mechanisms is true. And the BRI is already there in front of us. To ignore that as a model, I think we do that at our own peril. So as we enter a world of competitive multilateralism, I think it's important for countries like India, Europe, the US, Japan, at least some of us to come together and say, look, how do we limit the damage? Can we create some set of rules? And there, I think, European example. And saying, look, we want predictable rules. So I think there are ways in which you can influence the outcomes, provided we take an honest view and not carried away by illusions of the early 1990s, because the conditions that produce the multilateralism of the last 3 decades, those conditions are disappearing. And I think that's a reality. We have to come to terms with it. And that, I think we must start there, as Sanjay said in the beginning. And if we start with that, whether it's a resurrection, a rebirth, whatever it is, we can, I think, produce, even in an Indian way, a rebirth of the multilateral system.
Thank you very much, Radha. And with that, we come to a conclusion. And may I like to want to thank you. Thanks, Sanjay, Pascal, and Suresh Bhai for participating in this very exciting panel. This was very interesting discussion. We'll be producing a summary, including this discussion has been videotaped also. I would be happy to send it to you, all of you, and look forward to similar discussions in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pradeep. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pascal. Thank you, Sanjay.
And say happy birthday to Raja Mohan.
Yes, Sanjay.
Oh, Raja, happy birthday.
Yeah, by sheer accident. Thank you. Thank you all. Have a good day.
Have a good day.